Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Cassandra Sterling laughed as she poured the vintage champagne over Elena Sterling's thrifted blazer in front of the city's elite. The golden liquid splashed against Elena's chest, soaking through the cheap wool and blooming in a dark, ugly stain. Around them, the grand ballroom of the Sterling Plaza fell into a suffocating silence. The air, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and aged oak, seemed to vibrate with the sudden, sharp cruelty of the moment. "Oh, Elena," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with a mock sympathy that didn't reach her cold, triumphant eyes. She stood there in a $15,000 silk gown that shimmered like a serpent's scales under the crystal chandeliers. "I truly didn't see you standing there. You blend into the shadows so well in, whatever it is you're wearing." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the icy drip of the alcohol against her skin, but her gaze remained steady. She looked past her sister to the semicircle of witnesses. Arthur Sterling, their father, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of practiced disappointment. He didn't look at the wet stain on his eldest daughter's shoulder. He looked at the gold-embossed guest list in his hand, as if Elena were a typo he'd forgotten to delete. "Cassandra, don't be dramatic," Arthur said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "Your sister is just struggling to adjust to the real world after her 3-year sabbatical." "Sabbatical?" Cassandra snickered, leaning closer so only Elena could smell the cloyingly sweet hibiscus perfume. "Is that what we're calling being exiled for incompetence now? You should have stayed in the shadows, Elena. Coming here tonight just makes you look desperate." Martha Sterling, their mother, stepped forward, but not to offer a napkin. She reached out and adjusted the diamond necklace on Cassandra's throat, her eyes filled with pride for the daughter who now sat in the CEO's chair. "It's a big night for the family, Elena," Martha whispered, finally glancing at her with a flicker of annoyance. "Try not to make a scene. You've already embarrassed us enough by showing up looking like a charity case." Elena felt the familiar sting of the blood betrayal, the way her own parents had helped Cassandra dismantle her life piece by piece. 3 years ago, Elena had been the lead architect of the Sterling Heights development. She had poured her soul into the blueprints, only for Cassandra to forge her signature on a series of fraudulent subcontracts and then frame her for the ensuing scandal. "The Sterling Heights project was mine, Cassandra," Elena said. Her voice was low, a calm contrast to the jagged edges of her sister's laughter. "The board saw the records," Cassandra replied, waving a manicured hand toward the crowd of investors and politicians. "They saw the signatures. You were just the assistant who couldn't handle the pressure. Why are you even here, to beg for a job, to ask for a handout?" Cassandra turned back to the crowd, raising her empty glass. A toast. To the future of Sterling Urban, and to the wisdom of knowing when to cut out the dead weight. The social sycophants in the room chuckled, the sound of their collective judgment hitting Elena like a physical weight. She saw Julian Thorne, the rival developer, watching from the edge of the bar. He didn't join the laughter. His eyes, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on Elena, assessing the woman who had once been his most formidable competitor. Elena didn't argue. She didn't scream. Instead, she reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of the encrypted drive Elias Vance had hand-delivered to her tiny, cramped apartment that morning. The retired engineer had been the only one Cassandra couldn't buy. He had held onto the original structural logs, the ones that proved Cassandra had cut corners on the foundation to pocket $10 million in savings. The drive felt heavy, a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. "You're right, Cassandra," Elena said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest table of investors. "I do blend into the shadows, but you should remember, that's where you never see the predator coming." Cassandra's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she searched Elena's face for a sign of a breakdown. Finding none, she let out a sharp, dismissive huff. "Go home, Elena. You're damp, you're pathetic, and you're irrelevant." Elena turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the marble, a rhythmic, predatory sound that no one noticed over the swell of the orchestra. She passed Julian Thorne, who tipped his glass toward her in a silent, questioning gesture. She didn't stop. She didn't look back at the parents who had disowned her or the sister who had stolen her life. Outside, the city air was biting and sharp. Elena pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't touched in 3 years. "It's me," Elena said as the line clicked open. Her voice was as cold as the champagne still soaking into her blazer. "The Sterling Heights Gala just started. They think the foundation is solid." "And?" the voice on the other end, gravelly, tired, and loyal, asked. Elena looked up at the glowing logo of the Sterling Plaza, the building her grandfather had built, and her sister had turned into a monument of greed. She touched the damp spot on her chest, the humiliation fueling a fire that had been smoldering for 1,000 days. "Start the audit on the offshore accounts," Elena said. "I want the board to see the discrepancy by Monday morning." She ended the call and stepped into the dark, a small, cold smile finally touching her lips. Cassandra had 3 days before her world became a pile of ash, and Elena Sterling was the only one who knew where the matches were hidden. The next morning, the lobby of Sterling Global felt like a cathedral of cold marble and curated ego. Elena Sterling walked through the revolving doors, her spine a rigid line of defiance. She had traded the wine-stained blazer from the night before for a charcoal suit that fit like armor, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painted on. At the reception desk, the hushed murmurs of the morning staff died instantly. They knew what had happened at the gala. In the Sterling Empire, gossip traveled faster than the high-speed elevators. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of industrial air conditioning. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here," a voice drawled from the mezzanine. Cassandra Sterling stood at the top of the glass staircase, looking down with a predatory smirk. She was draped in cream silk, a sharp contrast to the dark silhouette of her sister. "I was just telling Arthur that we should have the locks changed. I didn't think I'd need to do it so soon." "I'm here for my personal files, Cassandra," Elena said. Her voice was steady, echoing against the high ceilings. She didn't look up, focusing instead on the cold weight of the elevator button under her thumb. "Your files." Cassandra descended the stairs, her designer heels clicking against the stone like a metronome of impending doom. The heavy, cloying scent of her expensive jasmine perfume arrived before she did. She stopped 3 inches from Elena's face, loud enough for the security guards and the gathering crowd of interns to hear every word. "Everything in this building belongs to the CEO. You're just a legacy error we haven't deleted yet. Security, escort this visitor to the basement." "I believe her things are in a cardboard box near the trash." The humiliation was calculated, a public stripping of rank in the very lobby their grandfather had built. Elena felt the heat of the staff stares, the mixture of pity and the cruel excitement people felt when watching a titan fall. She didn't flinch. Instead, she felt a rhythmic pulse in her pocket. Her phone was vibrating, a signal from her contact that the first phase of the audit had cleared the company's external firewall. "The basement is fine," Elena replied, her tone devoid of the anger her sister so clearly craved. "It's quieter there, harder to hear the walls cracking." Cassandra laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Always so dramatic. That's why you failed, Elena. You think you're in a tragedy, but you're just a footnote." She turned to the head of security, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Make sure she doesn't take anything that isn't hers. Check her pockets before she leaves. We wouldn't want any Sterling property accidentally disappearing with the help." Elena allowed the guard to lead her toward the service lift, her eyes catching a flicker of movement near the freight entrance. Elias Vance was there, dressed in a faded maintenance jumpsuit, a toolbox in his hand. The retired engineer had spent 30 years maintaining the infrastructure of this building. He knew the blind spots of every camera and the password to every subserver. He gave a single, microscopic nod. In the dim, flickering light of the loading dock, Elena found the box. It was damp, shoved against a leaking pipe near the recycling bins. She knelt, the rough cardboard scratching her palms. She pulled out the leather-bound journals of her grandfather, her fingers lingering on the embossed gold initials. Beneath the books lay a small, silver-encrypted drive that hadn't been there yesterday. Elias had done his job. Her phone buzzed again. It was a brief, encrypted message from Julian Thorne. First offshore discrepancy flagged. $4.2 million unaccounted for in the Cayman subsidiary. Monday morning is going to be a bloodbath. Elena tucked the drive into her waistband, the cold metal pressing against her skin. She looked up at the security camera mounted on the concrete pillar, knowing Cassandra was likely watching the feed from her ivory tower, savoring the sight of her sister digging through refuse. Elena didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. She looked like a woman who was finally holding the matches. "Enjoy the view while it lasts," she whispered, the words meant only for the lens. The board meeting was exactly 48 hours away, and the foundation of her sister's world was already turning to dust. Elena turned and walked into the shadows of the garage, the countdown to Monday morning echoing in every heartbeat. 2 days later, the glass facade of the Sterling Global headquarters reflected a sky the color of a bruised plum. Elena walked through the revolving doors, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished white marble of the lobby. She didn't look like the woman who had been scavenging through a damp parking garage 48 hours ago. She looked like a storm draped in charcoal wool. Every step was a calculated move toward the center of the tower, the encrypted drive in her blazer pocket feeling like a live wire against her ribs. "Still wearing that same brand of desperation, I see," a voice drawled from the direction of the elevators. Elena didn't need to turn to recognize the sharp, melodic cruelty of the speaker. Cassandra stood by the gold-plated directory, draped in a cream silk blouse that shimmered under the recessed lighting. She held a crystal flute of sparkling water as if it were a scepter, her eyes narrowed with a predatory gleam. "I watched the security footage from Saturday, Elena," Cassandra said, stepping forward until the cloying scent of her expensive lily-based perfume filled the space between them. "I saw you scrounging in the dark like a stray cat looking for scraps in my garage. It was almost sad. Did you think you'd find your lost dignity in a pile of Elias Vance's old trash?" The insult was loud enough to make the two receptionists behind the mahogany desk look up, their eyes darting between the sisters. Elena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike behind her eyes, but she didn't let her expression flicker. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing the hard edge of the drive. "I found exactly what I was looking for, Cassandra," she replied, her voice a calm, low vibration. "Sometimes the things people throw away are the only things with any real value left." Cassandra let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You're a ghost, Elena, and ghosts don't get a seat at the table. They just watch the living eat. Don't bother coming up to the executive floor. Security has already been told your badge is a relic." She didn't wait for a response, turning on her heel and disappearing into the private elevator. The doors hissed shut with a sound of finality, leaving Elena alone in the vast, echoing lobby. Elena moved toward the service stairs instead. 10 minutes later, she was in the windowless maintenance corridor of the 14th floor. The air here smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented halls above. Julian Thorne was waiting by the server room door, his face illuminated by the flickering green light of a status panel. He looked older than he had a year ago, the lines around his eyes deepened by the weight of what he knew. "You're late," he whispered, though there was no one around to hear. He took the drive from her and plugged it into a handheld terminal. His fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion as he bypassed the secondary encryption Elias had set. "Did you find it?" Elena asked. Julian's breath hitched. A series of spreadsheets began to scroll across the small screen, a waterfall of red numbers and flagged transactions. "It's worse than the initial flags suggested." She didn't just skim the Cayman subsidiary, Elena. She gutted it. 4.2 million moved through shell companies in 3 months, and look at the signatures. He zoomed in on a digitized document. The signature at the bottom was a perfect, elegant script. Elena Sterling. "She forged my name on the offshore transfers," Elena said, the cold realization settling in her gut. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was a frame-up designed to be her permanent exile. "The audit trail is undeniable now," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "But the board meeting is in less than 24 hours. If you don't present this exactly right, she'll bury you before you can open the file." "She thinks I'm coming to beg," Elena said, touching the screen where her forged name sat like a death warrant. "Let her keep thinking that." She left Julian in the shadows and took the public elevator to the executive lounge. She needed to see the rest of the players. Arthur and Martha Sterling were seated in the velvet-lined alcove overlooking the city, sipping over-extracted espresso that smelled burnt and bitter. Her father didn't look up from his tablet as she approached, but her mother's eyes widened, a flicker of something, shame or perhaps just annoyance, crossing her face. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. "Cassandra mentioned you were loitering downstairs. We agreed that your presence this week was a courtesy, not an invitation to interfere. Don't make a scene tomorrow. Your sister has worked herself to the bone to keep this family's name from being dragged through the mud while you were away." "The family name is already in the mud, Father," Elena said, standing at the edge of their circle. "You just haven't looked down yet." Martha set her cup down with a sharp clack against the saucer. "That's enough. Your sister is the CEO. She is the one who saved the Sterling legacy. If you have any gratitude left in you, you'll sit in the back of that boardroom, keep your mouth shut, and sign the severance papers she's prepared for you." Elena looked at them, the two people who had watched her be cast out without a single word of protest. They were so blinded by the luxury Cassandra provided that they couldn't see the rot in the foundation. "I'll be at the meeting," Elena said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "But I won't be signing anything." She turned and walked away before they could respond, the sound of her father's dismissive huff following her down the hall. She retreated to the small, cramped office they had assigned her in the basement levels, the pity desk Cassandra had joked about. She sat in the dim light, the countdown clock on her phone ticking toward 9:00 a.m. 21 hours. She pulled out the physical file Julian had printed, the hard copies of the forged signatures and the Cayman wire transfers. She ran her thumb over the embossed Sterling logo at the top of the page. Cassandra was upstairs right now, likely toasted to her upcoming victory with the board. She was at the peak of her arrogance, convinced that her sister was a broken woman looking for a handout. Elena leaned back, the silence of the basement wrapping around her. She wasn't broken. She was the only one in the building who knew the truth, and in less than a day, the ivory tower was going to scream. She closed her eyes, visualizing the boardroom, the witnesses, and the look on Cassandra's face when the first red number hit the screen. "Wait for it," she whispered to the empty room. "Just wait for it." The morning of the final countdown arrived with a deceptive stillness that blanketed the Sterling estate. Elena sat at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, the scent of expensive Arabica beans and fresh-cut lilies filling the air. She watched the steam rise from her cup, her fingers steady, a stark contrast to the storm she knew was brewing just beyond the horizon. Cassandra swept into the room 10 minutes late, the sharp click of her designer stilettos echoing against the marble floors like a metronome of arrogance. She was draped in cream silk that likely cost more than a year of Elena's previous salary, her face a mask of polished triumph. She didn't sit. She hovered, looking down at her sister with a pity that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "I've decided to be generous, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with a faux sweetness that made Elena's skin crawl. She signaled the maid to pour her juice without looking at the woman. "I'll let you keep your childhood bedroom for another week after the board vote tomorrow. It'll give you time to find a shelter or a studio apartment that fits your current lifestyle." Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the heat grounding her. "That's very thoughtful of you, Cassandra. But I wouldn't start packing my things just yet. The foundation of this house, and the company, is much more fragile than you realize." Cassandra let out a sharp, jagged laugh that grated against the quiet of the morning. "Always the dramatic architect. You were always obsessed with what lay beneath the surface, while I was building the towers. That's why I'm the CEO and you're a guest in a house that no longer belongs to you. Tomorrow at 9, the board signs the final severance. You'll be a ghost in the Sterling history books." Arthur Sterling entered then, his footsteps heavy. He didn't look at Elena, choosing instead to adjust his silk tie in the gilded mirror. He looked older, the weight of the family's lies carving deep lines into his face, yet he remained a silent pillar for the daughter he believed held the power. Martha Sterling followed, her silence a familiar, suffocating shroud. "Arthur," Elena said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "Have you looked at the Vance reports recently? The ones regarding the structural integrity of the waterfront project?" Arthur paused, his hand hovering over his lapel. For a fraction of a second, doubt flickered in his eyes, a shadow of the man who used to value the truth. But Cassandra stepped between them, her perfume, a cloying, expensive jasmine filling the space. "Don't listen to her, father," Cassandra snapped, her composure slipping into a snarl for a brief moment. "She's desperate. She's trying to use Elias Vance's old ramblings to scare us. The man is a retired relic, and Elena is just a bitter woman with no cards left to play." Elena stood up, smoothing the fabric of her modest slacks. She felt the hard edge of the encrypted flash drive in her pocket, a secret weight that felt like a loaded weapon. She looked at Cassandra, really looked at her, seeing the cracks in the facade that the other woman was too proud to notice. "Arrogance is a blindfold, Cassandra," Elena said softly. "You're so busy looking at the crown that you haven't noticed the throne is made of glass. Is that a threat?" Cassandra sneered, stepping closer until she was inches from Elena's face. "Because from where I'm standing, you have nothing. No allies, no money, and no name. Tomorrow, I'm going to enjoy watching security escort you out of the building." "I suppose we'll see who's being escorted," Elena replied. She turned to Arthur and Martha, her expression unreadable. "I'll see you at the meeting. I suggest you both arrive early. It's going to be a very long day." She walked out of the dining room without looking back, the sound of her own sensible shoes a steady, rhythmic promise of justice. As she stepped into the crisp morning air, she pulled out her phone. One message was waiting from Julian Thorne. "The board members have received the private invitations for the pre-session briefing. They think it's from Cassandra. See you at 800. Elena gripped the phone, her heart a drumbeat of anticipation. The trap was set. The witnesses were gathered. All that remained was for the clock to strike 9. The morning air was sharp, a biting chill that bypassed Elena Sterling's wool coat as she stood outside the glass monolith of Sterling Global. It was barely 7:30, and the financial district was just beginning to stir with the frantic energy of people chasing ghosts. She checked her watch, a simple, silver piece that had belonged to her grandmother, and felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of the seconds ticking toward 9. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was sterile, smelling of industrial ozone, and the cloying scent of the lilies that sat in massive crystal vases near the security desk. Elena moved across the polished marble, her sensible heels producing a muted, confident thud that echoed in the cavernous space. She didn't look like a woman who had been cast out 5 years ago. She looked like the person who had designed the very floor she walked on. Julian Thorne was waiting by the private elevators. He was a silhouette of sharp angles against the morning light, his expression unreadable as he held a leather portfolio against his chest. As she approached, he didn't offer a greeting, merely a slight inclination of his head. "The board members started arriving 10 minutes ago," he said, his voice low and steady. "They're in the executive lounge. They think Cassandra called them for a strategy update before the official session." Elena nodded, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the flash drive tucked into her pocket. "And my sister. She's on her way up from the garage. She's in a celebratory mood, apparently. She ordered a catered champagne brunch for the boardroom for 10:30. Confidence is a dangerous thing when it's built on sand," Elena murmured. They stepped into the elevator. The ascent was silent, the pressure in her ears the only indicator of their rising status. When the doors slid open on the 42nd floor, the The tension was already thick enough to taste. The executive floor was a maze of glass and brushed steel, designed to make everyone feel exposed and small. At 8:15, the heavy double doors of the lobby swung open, and Cassandra Sterling entered. She didn't walk, she marched, flanked by two assistants who struggled to keep pace with her predatory stride. She was dressed in a suit the color of dried blood, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful. She looked every bit the CEO the world believed her to be, powerful, untouchable, and utterly ruthless. She stopped dead when she saw Elena standing near the coffee station. "You've got to be joking," Cassandra said, her voice carrying across the suite and causing a group of junior analysts to freeze mid-conversation. She didn't look at Elena's face. She looked at her clothes with a sneer that suggested she'd found a cockroach in a Michelin-starred kitchen. "I thought I made it clear that your presence wasn't required. Or did you come back to beg for a severance package? I might find a few cents in the couch cushions if you're truly desperate." Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitter heat grounding her. "I'm here for the meeting, Cassandra, as we discussed." Cassandra let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of Director Holloway, who was emerging from the lounge. "The meeting is for stakeholders and leadership. You are neither. You're a footnote, Elena. A mistake we're finally erasing from the ledger." She stepped closer, her expensive perfume, something heavy with jasmine and musk, filling the space between them like a physical barrier. "Security is on their way up. If you leave now, I won't have them drag you out in front of the board. Think of it as my final act of sisterly charity." "I'd prefer to stay," Elena said, her voice a calm contrast to Cassandra's rising heat. "I think the board would find my perspective enlightening." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine rage flickering behind her carefully curated mask. "Your perspective is a fantasy. You're nothing. You have nothing." She turned her back on Elena, addressing the room at large. "Director Holloway, so glad you could make it. Please ignore the intruder. She was just leaving." Arthur and Martha Sterling arrived moments later, looking like ghosts of their former selves. Arthur's suit hung loosely on his frame, and Martha's hand trembled as she clutched her designer handbag. They avoided Elena's gaze, moving toward Cassandra as if drawn by a magnetic force they couldn't resist. "Is everything ready?" Arthur asked, his voice thin. He didn't look at Elena, but his shoulders were hunched, a man waiting for a blow he knew was coming. "Everything is perfect, Father," Cassandra said, her tone dripping with a performative sweetness that made Elena's skin crawl. "The transition will be seamless. By noon, the Sterling name will be synonymous with growth again, without any of the dead weight." She cast a pointed look at Elena over her shoulder, a smirk playing on her lips. By 8:45, the board members had filtered into the main boardroom. It was a room designed for executions, featuring a mahogany table that could seat 30 and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city Cassandra thought she owned. Elena watched from the doorway as they took their seats. These were men and women who valued two things above all else: profit and reputation. Cassandra had promised them both, and they sat with the expectant air of people waiting for a windfall. Julian moved to the head of the table, setting up the digital display. He caught Elena's eye for a fraction of a second. The trap was fully formed. The witnesses were in their places, their expensive pens poised over leather-bound notebooks. Cassandra took her seat at the head of the table, the queen of a crumbling empire. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:55. "Let's begin the pre-session," Cassandra announced, her voice booming with unearned authority. She looked toward the door, her smirk widening when she saw Elena still standing there. "Security is just down the hall, Elena. This is your last chance to walk away with a shred of dignity." Elena didn't move. She checked her grandmother's watch one last time. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Elena replied. The digital clock on the boardroom wall flipped. 0900. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and the hum of the air conditioning seemed to drop an octave, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. Cassandra leaned forward, her hands flat on the mahogany table. "Welcome, everyone," Cassandra said, her eyes locked on the board members. Today, we secure the future of Sterling Global, but before we get to the numbers, there's a small matter of house cleaning we need to attend to. She gestured toward Elena, her face twisted in a mask of triumph. But before she could utter the command to have her sister removed, the massive screen behind her flickered to life, not with the quarterly projections Cassandra had prepared, but with a series of encrypted file directories that made the room go deathly quiet. Elena stepped into the room, her shadow stretching long across the table. "You're right about one thing, Cassandra. It is time for some house cleaning." Elena Sterling stood in the center of the boardroom, her shadow cast long and sharp against the glowing screen. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the room, a low, electric vibration that seemed to rattle the very bones of the mahogany table. On the screen, the file directory didn't show quarterly earnings or growth projections. Instead, it displayed a series of encrypted logs titled Project Horizon, Stress Test Revisions. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone present. Elena watched her sister. The transformation in Cassandra Sterling was visceral. Her meticulously painted face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, began to disintegrate in real time. The blood fled from her skin, leaving behind a pallor so stark it made the rouge on her cheekbones look like fresh bruises. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, grew glassy and unfocused, darting toward the exits as if searching for a shadow to hide in. Her throat worked convulsively, a frantic, silent swallowing motion that betrayed the terror she was trying to choke down. The hand she had used to point at the door now gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned, her knuckles turning a ghostly, bloodless white. "What is this?" Arthur Sterling finally spoke, his voice a ragged whisper. He didn't look at Elena, his eyes were glued to the screen, specifically to the digital timestamp and the login ID associated with the final edits. It was a sequence of characters he knew by heart. It was the administrative bypass code for the CEO's private terminal. "It's the truth, Father," Elena said, her voice like a scalpel, cold, precise, and cutting. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "These are the original engineering logs Elias Vance tried to give you 5 years ago. The ones that proved the bridge supports were failing before the first stone was even laid. The ones that disappeared the night I was cast out." Martha Sterling let out a soft, strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat as she looked at her eldest daughter. Julian Thorne, the firm's lead counsel, leaned forward, his professional mask hardening into a look of grim calculation. He began tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat with his pen against his tablet, already mentally distancing the firm from the woman sitting at the head of the table. Across the room, 2 other board members exchanged a look of pure poison, physically shifting their chairs inches away from Cassandra as if her ruin were contagious. "It's a forgery," Cassandra whispered, though the words lacked any of her usual venom. She looked at the board, her gaze pleading. "Elena is a disgraced engineer. She's been bitter for years. She probably spent her entire exile fabricating this." "The files are digitally signed, Cassandra," Julian Thorne said, his voice devoid of his usual sycophancy. He didn't even look at her. "The encryption keys are unique to the Sterling Global mainframe. They can't be fabricated." Elena stepped closer to the table, the scent of ozone from the projector mixing with the expensive, floral perfume that now seemed to sour on her sister's skin. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a single, heavy document, sliding it across the polished wood toward Arthur. "Elias Vance didn't just keep the logs," Elena said. "He kept the correspondence. He kept every email where Cassandra threatened his pension if he didn't sign off on the cost-saving measures. He kept the recordings of the phone calls where she told him I was the one who would take the fall if anything went wrong." Arthur Sterling picked up the paper, his hands trembling. He looked at the signature at the bottom, a sloppy, hurried scrawl he recognized as his own daughter's. The room seemed to grow colder, the air conditioning humming like a funeral dirge. "You didn't just steal my life," Elena said, her eyes locked on her sister's crumbling form. "You risked hundreds of lives for a profit margin. You let me walk away with a tarnished name while you sat in this chair, pretending to be the savior of this family." Cassandra tried to stand, but her knees seemed to buckle, forcing her back into the leather chair. She looked like a ghost of herself, a hollowed-out shell of the woman who had laughed as Elena's bags were packed 5 years ago. "I'm not here for an apology," Elena said, her voice echoing in the dead silence. "And I'm not here to ask for my place back. I'm here because I now hold 41% of Sterling Global's outstanding debt through my private holding firm. Combined with the proxies Julian has already signed over in exchange for legal immunity, I am now the majority stakeholder." Elena leaned down, her face inches from her sister S. "Clean out your desk, Cassandra. You have until noon." Security is already waiting in the lobby. Without waiting for a response, Elena turned on her heel. The sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound as she walked toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back at the wreckage of her family. She had spent 5 years in the dark. It was time for Cassandra to see how it felt. 10 seconds of absolute, crushing silence followed Elena Sterling's ultimatum. In the high-ceilinged boardroom of Sterling Global, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the final moments of an empire. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and the faint, metallic tang of ozone from the projector hum. Cassandra Sterling didn't move at first. She sat frozen at the head of the mahogany table, her fingers still curled around a gold-plated fountain pen. Then, a sharp, jagged laugh broke from her throat, a sound so brittle it seemed like it might shatter the crystal carafe sitting between them. "You're delusional," Cassandra spat, though her voice lacked its usual razor-edged conviction. She looked toward the head of the table, seeking an anchor. "Father, tell her, tell this ghost that she can't just walk in here with a few forged papers and claim a seat that isn't hers." Arthur Sterling didn't look at his eldest daughter. His hand, liver-spotted and trembling, reached for his glasses. He stared at the documents Elena had placed on the table as if they were a death warrant. Beside him, Martha Sterling pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The silence from the parents who had once cast Elena into the cold was the first real blow. "The papers aren't forged, Cassandra," a new voice cut through the tension. Julian Thorne stepped forward from the shadows near the door. He didn't look like the subordinate Cassandra had bullied for years. He looked like a man who had finally stepped into the light. He tapped a command into his tablet, and the massive screen behind Elena flickered. "The debt acquisition was finalized at 4:02 this morning. Every cent of the Sterling Global shortfall is now owned by Elena's firm. And these," he added, scrolling through a list of names, "are the proxies. The board has already voted. You just weren't invited to the meeting." That was when the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Cassandra's skin, usually a perfect porcelain achieved through thousands of dollars in treatments, turned a sickly, mottled gray. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, darted around the room like a trapped animal, wide and rimmed with sudden, frantic red. Her lower lip trembled, a tiny, rhythmic twitch that she couldn't suppress no matter how hard she gritted her teeth. The arrogance that had defined her posture for a decade dissolved, leaving her shoulders hunched and her neck strained, the tendons standing out like taut wires. She looked smaller, withered, as if the very air had been sucked out of her lungs. "No," Cassandra whispered, the word catching in a throat suddenly gone dry. "I built this. I saved this family while she was rotting in whatever hole she crawled into." "You didn't save us," Arthur said, his voice a hollow rasp. He finally looked up, but not at Elena. He looked at Cassandra with a mixture of pity and profound exhaustion. "You lied to us. You told us the company was thriving while you bled it dry to cover your own tracks. Elena didn't destroy this family, Cassandra. You did. She's just the one picking up the pieces." The reaction from the rest of the room was instantaneous. 2 board members who had been Cassandra's staunchest defenders suddenly stood, pushing their chairs back with a synchronized screech of wood on carpet. They didn't offer her a word of comfort. Instead, they moved toward Elena, their faces twisted into masks of professional regret. "Elena, we had no idea of the extent of the mismanagement," one whispered, extending a hand that Elena ignored. Martha finally looked up, her eyes glistening with tears that felt 5 years too late. "Elena, darling, surely we can talk about this, at home, over dinner." Elena felt the cold mahogany of the table under her palms. The darling felt like a physical insult, a cheap coat of paint over a crumbling wall. She didn't feel the rush of heat she expected. She felt only a profound, icy clarity. "I don't have a home with you, Martha," Elena said. The use of her mother's first name caused the older woman to flinch as if struck. "And I don't take dinner with people who trade their children for a higher stock price." She turned her gaze back to her sister. Cassandra was hyperventilating now, her manicured nails digging into the leather of her executive chair, tearing the hide. She looked at the door, where 2 men in dark suits had appeared. They didn't look like the private security Cassandra was used to. They looked like the inevitability of a life's worth of mistakes catching up. "It's 12:05, Cassandra," Elena said, her voice dropping to a level that forced everyone to lean in to hear. "You're 5 minutes past my deadline. You can't do this," Cassandra shrieked, her voice cracking as she was hauled upward by the security team. "I am a Sterling. I am the CEO." "You were the CEO," Elena corrected, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Now you're just a woman with a very long list of creditors and a very short list of friends. Security will escort you to the curb. Your personal belongings will be sent to a P.O. box. Don't bother coming to the house. The locks were changed an hour ago." As the guards began to lead the sobbing, struggling woman toward the exit, the rest of the family stood in a stunned, silent row. They looked at Elena, waiting for a sign, a gesture of mercy, or perhaps an invitation to stay. Elena didn't give them one. She gathered her tablet and her coat, the fabric smooth and expensive against her skin. She had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, imagining the things she would say, the ways she would gloat. But as she looked at the wreckage of the people who had betrayed her, she realized that the greatest revenge wasn't what she took from them. It was the fact that she no longer needed anything they had to give. "Julian, start the audit," Elena said, walking toward the door without a backward glance at her parents. "I want to know exactly how much she stole before the sun goes down." She stepped out into the hallway, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her with a final, echoing thud. The hallway was bright, filled with the midday sun, and for the first time in half a decade, Elena Sterling breathed air that didn't taste like ash. 6 months later, the air in the city finally felt clean. Elena Sterling stood on the skeletal remains of what would soon be the Sterling Commons, a sprawling mixed-use development designed to revitalize the very district her sister had tried to bulldoze for a quick profit. The scent of fresh rain on wet concrete and the sharp, clean aroma of sawdust filled her lungs. It was a far cry from the stifling, perfume-heavy boardrooms where she had spent the last 5 years fighting for her life. Julian Thorne stepped up beside her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He handed her a tablet, but he didn't look at the blueprints. He looked at her. "The final audit on the offshore accounts is finished," he said, his voice steady against the rhythmic thrum of a distant jackhammer. "There's nothing left, Elena, not for them." Elena took the device, her fingers brushing the cool glass. She swiped through the documents. The numbers were staggering. Cassandra Sterling had been stripped of every asset, the penthouse, the fleet of cars, the designer wardrobe that had been her armor. Even the family estate had been liquidated to cover the massive fraud settlements. "Where is she now?" Elena asked. She didn't ask out of longing, but for the same reason an architect checks the stability of a foundation. She needed to know the debris had been cleared. "A studio apartment in the North End," Julian replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's a walk-up, above a laundromat. The court-appointed receiver found her trying to hide a set of vintage pearls in a frozen pea bag during the eviction. They were seized along with everything else." The image of Cassandra, the woman who once claimed she couldn't breathe in a room that cost less than $10,000 a night, living above a noisy laundromat, provided a sharp, cold spike of satisfaction. It was the face slap that kept echoing. Cassandra had spent her life looking down on the world. Now the world didn't even bother to look at her. "And Arthur and Martha?" Elena asked, the names feeling heavy on her tongue. "Living on a fixed pension in a retirement community in Florida," Julian said. "Arthur tried to call the office yesterday. He wanted to know if you were attending the groundbreaking ceremony today. He said he was proud of the new direction of the firm." Elena's grip tightened on the tablet. The audacity of the word proud felt like a physical weight. For years, they had watched Cassandra systematically dismantle her reputation, and they had chosen the comfort of a lie over the difficulty of the truth. They weren't proud of her. They were desperate for a seat at the table she had built from the wreckage they helped create. "Did you take the call?" she asked. "I told him you were unavailable," Julian said, "and that the Sterling name was under new management." "Permanently?" Elena nodded, a sense of finality settling over her. She looked out over the construction site. This was the new architecture of her life, one built on transparency and merit rather than the hollow prestige her parents worshipped. An hour later, as the press began to gather for the ceremony, Elena spotted two familiar figures standing near the perimeter fence. Arthur and Martha Sterling looked smaller than she remembered. Arthur's suit, once bespoke and sharp, looked slightly too big for his frame, and Martha's face was etched with a frantic, hopeful energy that made Elena's stomach turn. They tried to catch her eye, Martha raising a gloved hand in a tentative wave. It was a plea for a sign, an invitation to step back into the circle of family. Elena didn't wave back. She didn't scowl or shout. She simply turned her shoulder, focusing her attention on Elias Vance, who had arrived as her guest of honor. The retired engineer looked rejuvenated, his eyes bright as he watched the cranes move. He was the man who had risked everything to give her the truth, and he was the only family she recognized today. "Ready, Elena?" Elias asked, offering her the ceremonial silver shovel. "Ready," she said. As she drove the blade into the earth, the cameras flashed, capturing the moment the old Sterling legacy was buried for good. But as the applause broke out, Elena felt the sharp, cold sting of the cost. She had won. She had her company, her reputation, and her fortune. But she was standing in the center of a crowded field, and there was no one left who shared her childhood memories. The victory was absolute, and it was lonely. She looked up at the skyline, where the old Sterling Tower still stood, though its sign had already been removed. It was a hollow shell, much like the people who had occupied it. Elena took a deep breath, the taste of the city air crisp and bracing. She had spent half a decade seeking justice, and now that she had it, she realized it wasn't a destination. It was a floor. She turned away from the cameras and the ghosts at the fence, walking toward the future she had designed for herself. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in the rearview mirror but ash and the people who had chosen to burn with it.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.